Hello, and welcome to the second in our series of asynchronous virtual roundtables on reopening cities with and post-COVID. An asynchronous virtual roundtable is one where the interviews have already been taking place and integrated into a single roundtable. After we play the interviews, we will have a live Q&A at the end. So for that, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. I'm Hani Mamasani. I'm director of the Northwestern University Transportation Center, and I will be your moderator. So today we have part two of our session on the vital role that public transportation plays in reopening our cities, a role in cities' mobility and the economies of these cities. In part one, we spoke to leaders of transit agencies in the US, featuring Chicago, Jacksonville, and Washington, D.C. Today, we seek international perspectives and best practices. And so we're pleased to feature Kevin Desmond, who is the Chief Executive Officer of TransLink, Metro Vancouver's transportation authority. Then we'll have Julian Ware, who is head of corporate finance at Transport for London. And then Jérôme Pourbet, who is senior director for global growth at the International Association of Public Transport, UITP. We have a very interesting session ahead. So Kevin, you're Chief Executive Officer of TransLink, Metro Vancouver's transportation authority that provides over 1.4 million, I guess, trips every day. On normal days, I would assume that was
before COVID, yes.
Before COVID, yes. I guess it's now BC, before COVID. You oversee planning, financing, management of a region-wide multimodal transit network. And I think that multimodal aspect is important because we're going to come back and talk about that. That includes bus, SkyTrain, SeaBus, HandyDART, and West Coast Express with nearly 7,800 employees. Prior to TransLink, you were in Seattle. You were general manager of King County Metro Transit and have had, again, a long distinguished career in the transit world in Tacoma before, Seattle, and New York City earlier. So I'm going to start first about the, I guess, let's call it the lockdown period, essentially the May to March period. And it's, we're kind of beginning to recover from that period, depending on locations and so on. But with those lockdown orders, social economic activities dramatically changed over that time. And obviously transit ridership dropped considerably in all cities of the world. Now, as some of these restrictions are being relaxed, allowing restaurants, retail establishment to open under certain guidelines. If you look at cell phone probe data, we have seen that overall mobility indicators have bounced back significantly, but there's still quite a bit of apprehension towards transit, again, understandably, given the pandemic situation that we're still dealing with. But yet many essential workers can't get to work without transit, and many of our larger cities would choke without an efficient public transportation system. So our main theme today is about reconciling these health-related concerns, if not fears, with the need to, for efficient mobility in our recovering cities, and how to regain the public's trust that transit is capable of delivering safe and efficient mobility. And so, like most agencies, I believe, TransLink had various cleaning, disinfection, etc. programs in place. But what would you say have been the most challenging operational aspects during, that sort of lockdown period? Has it been just the ability to maintain that cleaning, disinfecting schedule, getting PPEs, the health of workers, or adjusting schedules to address shifting ridership patterns during that period? What would you say has been the most challenging operational issues for you?
Well, and I'd add to that the bleeding of revenue and the intense loss of revenue. I'll just quickly start with that. TransLink has a very high fare box recovery. It's higher than most every transit system in the United States and Canada. About 57% of our operating costs was recovered by the fare, and about a quarter of our revenue came from gas tax. So both of them collapsed. Gas tax has come back, as people are beginning to return to work and normal activities. And in fact, what we're seeing with the cordon counts that we have over bridges in our region, that we're beginning to see traffic returning to fairly close to pre-COVID levels during peak periods, whereas transit ridership is still down. So in the immediate crisis management phase, we had to consider three things: the health and safety of our employees, how we had to innovate and improvise an operating environment like all of our colleagues worldwide, and of course in the context of about a 50% reduction in our revenues. So we were just frightened by that whole view of still trying to provide essential services safely for employees and customers while seeing a collapse of our revenue was, it's a crisis of without any precedent at all. So setting aside the financial problem, our biggest concern actually early on was the health and safety of our frontline employees, most importantly. And that was very true for our bus operators. SkyTrain is an automated system, so we don't have operators on the trains. We do have field personnel. So for TransLink, the biggest issue was the health and safety of our 4,000 bus operators. So intense work with our union, the various things that we had to do to limit ridership on the buses. So like transit agencies throughout, we stopped fare collection, rear door boarding only. That, of course, further undermined our finances. Eventually blocking off every other seat on the buses with placards. Many transit agencies worldwide did that. So in effect, reducing the practical capacity of our system to about 30% of normal. Then as we began to think about how to restore the front door boarding and fare collection, which we did on June 1st, we had to work with the union and seeing what other cities were doing to create barriers for the bus operator compartment. Fortunately, about a third of our buses already had the permanent barriers. So we had a program in place that was going in place, but we also then put up the vinyl sort of short-term version. That seems to have worked well. We put that in place by June 1st. Of course, extending the cleaning of all of our rolling stock and facilities. We're really in the mainstream with what folks were doing worldwide. We launched at the beginning of June as well what we call our Safe Operating Action Plan. The acronym for that is SOAP. So it included desanitization procedures, cleaning procedures. We're beginning to install hand sanitizers at our SkyTrain facilities and our bus facilities and on a limited number of buses themselves. As a pilot, we want to see how well it works and the operations and maintenance associated with that. Decals and stickers on where people should stand to promote social distancing. And it also meant operating 100% of our pre-COVID service levels. So we did work out with our province here some sense of assurance that we will find financial relief eventually that gave us the wherewithal to continue operating 100% service. So even as we're still at about 30%, 37% of pre-COVID ridership, you still can't really have 6-foot social distancing on mass transit. And as ridership continues to increase, that's just not going to be possible. So we also have to ask our customers to do the right thing. That includes, not touching your hands and face, washing your hands frequently, and please wear a mask. And, the issue of masks is a big issue, throughout the world. And it's an issue in our region. It's not mandated in British Columbia or on TransLink. So it's really encouraging people to wear a mask. All of that to mitigate the social distancing. Now, we're still planning from a practical standpoint the capacity of our system on the buses at 2/3 of normal capacity, and on SkyTrain and our ferry SeaBus service 50%. So it's this combination of capacity management, cleaning of our facilities, operating full service, and asking our customers what they can be doing to keep themselves safe. I personally believe the key is what you can be doing as the rider to keep yourself safe. And I think all the lessons learned from March until now is if you're practicing your own hygiene correctly, and using all of the advice that you get from public health authorities, you're going to keep yourself safe, and more importantly, you're going to keep everybody else safe.
So as
Now,
part of
last thing I would say, and I think the value of even what you're doing here at Northwestern University is we've been, ever since this crisis started, we consume worldwide information from APTA, from CUDA, from UITP, et cetera, other institutions. What are the worldwide emerging best practices? And TransLink is firmly in the mainstream of all the worldwide best practices.
It's great to hear. And that's why we're delighted that you could be with us today. So you mentioned, of course, Safe Operating Action Plan currently, and that I believe includes guidance for how to use transit now that you've disseminated to the public. You mentioned that at one point you actually had placards on seats, etc. Do you still have that, or have you you've moved away?
So right now, what we're assuming from a practical capacity on whether it's 40 or 60-foot buses is a fully seated load.
Okay.
So we would prefer no standees. Then the bus operator has the discretion, once his or her bus is at a fully seated load capacity, to then close the doors. Okay. Now, because we're only at about, on the bus side, we're about 41% of pre-COVID ridership. Most of the buses are operating well within that practical capacity. We do have some buses that are crowded. And one of the things that our bus operators are doing, they have the ability to reallocate on a real-time basis highly underutilized trips and put those buses on trips that are suffering or experiencing crowding. And with our next big service change in September, we're going to formalize that a little bit. So there'll be a shift in the proportion of full-time operator runs, operator trips, to more flexible spare board operations, where we can, to use our jargon, you can run trippers, and then, we can move those buses and therefore those operators who are working the spare board to where they're most needed. So the formal schedule will not be as rigid as it was. So we've got to have that flexibility in real time to match capacity to demand. And in the context of a different approach to capacity management because of social distancing. Yeah, and I believe the CTA in Chicago has been doing something similar for buses, because again, they have found that on some routes, in fact, there's been quite a bit of return of ridership in a way, which is exceeding their guidelines for distancing and capacity limitations. So I wanted to ask you, staying with this sort of Safe Operating Action Plan, you mentioned, I guess, customer collaboration, if you want to call it that. How cooperative have riders been so far? Well, let's put it this way. There's an interesting context, and this is going to be contextual for city after city throughout the world. BC has been extremely successful with managing COVID. So in fact, our public health director here has become a bit of a worldwide celebrity. So we flattened the curve a while ago, and number of cases are very, very low. It's very different than, certainly what's going on in the United States now. So I think the public was doing what they were asked to do and trained to do months ago by public health authorities. So we really don't have a big problem at the moment. So within the context of transit, I think I would think by inference, people are doing the right thing. Now, masks, because it's not mandated, and because I think people, and because there's plenty of space for the most part on buses and trains, we think about a third of our riders are wearing masks at this point. I personally believe, I wish more would. And as buses and trains become more crowded, as ridership comes back over the summer, and assuming we don't have a significant second wave, we continue to see ridership coming back during the course of the fall. As buses and trains become a little more crowded, I think more important, people need to wear masks. But that needs to be done in concert with our public health authorities here. What I've seen elsewhere, anywhere else in the world, and in Canada, is the messaging and the mandating of masks generally comes from government officials, not from transit agencies. We don't really have, in a certain sense, the moral authority to mandate it. And the issue of enforcement anyway is very tricky.
Yeah.
So for the moment, I think people generally, you know, keeping social distancing, standing where the decals suggest you stand. Yes, I think people are really doing that because the messaging has been so clear from our public health authority here.
On the other hand, airlines are mandating masks, but it's a somewhat different situation because you don't let somebody on the plane if they're not wearing a mask, and that's a little different. You can't exactly do that.
Yes, and you know, you're gating people in, and there are different ways to control the environment. You know, the issue of controlling the environment on a bus, it's very simple, similar to fare evasion in the bus environment. You know, you don't want your bus operator to be an enforcement agent. You ask for a fare and you ask another time for a fare, and then, you know, you deal with it. So at the moment, we want to raise awareness.
That's right.
And we want to encourage. We've given away, you know, some masks, and we're going to continue to do things like that. But for now, it's encourage, raise awareness, and if we need to take it to another level with working with public health authorities here in British Columbia, we will do that.
Of course, gaining public trust or regaining the public's trust in mass transit is an issue around the world, you know, in many cities. And you mentioned that you're already engaged with the UITP and other to kind of share best practices. How is TransLink soliciting feedback from its riders to gain insight about, again, the level of trust or confidence that they have, and whether they feel that some of the changes in operational practices are in fact meeting their expectations? Are there any formal customer satisfaction tracking programs underway perhaps, or are you getting information mostly anecdotally or through social media and so on?
All of the above. So we fielded a survey probably 6, almost 8 weeks ago, asking a whole bunch of questions about your previous use of transit and your current attitudes about transit and your projected attitudes and use of transit. And the results of that survey actually are pretty consistent with other survey information, certainly in Canada, and other survey information that I've seen worldwide. You know, the reluctance to come back immediately, but for us in Vancouver, which otherwise had exceptional ridership trends over the last few years, I think the silver lining was over 3/4 of the respondents said eventually they'll come back. So that's the good news. The bad news is what happens to the other 25%. Now, since we stabilized our system, and since British Columbia announced its BC Restart Plan, which we're in the 3rd phase of now, and that took place on May 19th. We are now fielding, probably go out to the field actually next week, that type of customer satisfaction survey. We're going to re-ask many of the questions that we asked several weeks ago about attitudes about coming back to transit, but we've added questions about what's your awareness about our safe operating plan, and, you know, and take it through a series of typical market research questions to get a sense of, are you aware of the program? Are you satisfied with the program? What could we be doing different? Asking questions about wearing masks. Of course, we get information from customer complaints, from social media. So, you know, any and all ways that we would typically be keeping in touch with customer attitudes, we are. For the most part, I think that, you know, our customers are giving us good feedback, not significant complaints. We're not under any pressure to be doing anything different than we're doing right now at this point in time. The more scientific market research will give us some better information. That data should be at the top line available to us in 3 or 4 weeks.
Thank you. So looking ahead, I guess both medium term and then longer term, you already alluded to the fact that you intend to be doing more real-time allocation of of vehicles to different routes in order to mitigate some capacity issues along certain routes. Can you tell us about how TransLink might be using data to monitor ongoing progress and development? What kind of data, how collected? Is it mostly sort of pre-COVID type data collection, or have you put in place perhaps some new approaches so that you could implement strategies in real time, for instance?
Well, the real-time information such that we have it is twofold. We have an automated fare collection system, our Compass card. So it's On the rail side, it's tap on and tap off. On the bus side, it's tap only. And the vast majority of our on SkyTrain, everybody has to use a Compass product. And on bus, the large share of our riders use Compass and not cash. So we've got, in real time, pretty good sense of boardings in the system, and that's augmented by automated passenger counters as well. So we have a pretty good sense of trending. Now, this sort of move that we've seen in some places in the world to have real-time apps to give people real information about whether their prospective train or bus might be crowded or not. We don't really have the capacity to give accurate data. We could have done something that would have created, a series of algorithms and predictions, but it would always have been based on past information and not really real time. Okay. And we chose not to do that because we just didn't think it'd be accurate enough. It would be, you're sort of predicting something based on prior activity, but we know certainly that on any given day, a bus could be crowded or not, or a train could be crowded for any number of different circumstances, separate from trends. So we're going to continue to look at that, and if someone comes up with a great application that we can use better, and to be perfectly candid, I'm not entirely sure that that's really going to change people's confidence in the system. I know that cities that have done it, it sounds good. It's cool. And if it's accurate, why not do it? But is that really going to change in any substantial material way people's confidence in significant numbers to use transit? I don't know. I actually tend to doubt it, to be perfectly honest, for your audience that's watching this. I think people have to have a better, broader societal sense. Am I safe to go out in public? And do I think transit's a safe place? The extent to which we can provide information, say, look, if you don't have to ride in the peak period, don't ride in the peak period, because that's when you're more likely to see a crowded bus or train. And our usual customers already know that. And what we've seen, our normal peak to base ridership has flattened. We are seeing a flatter day, and in fact, our ridership is returning faster in the off-peak period than the peak period, which is really a good thing. We want to see that.
Have you considered at all using cell phone data?
I think our folks are looking at some of that to see the extent to which I believe both Apple and Google through Android have some open source information that's available. And our data scientists are looking at that. I think there are some limitations as well on the accuracy of that information, because it captures many riders, but not all riders.
Exactly. And this is where algorithms can come in and maybe fill in some of those gaps. So
that's where, if we, as our data scientists, our specialists, look at that and they see, okay, now we see how we can use that well. And especially if someone external to TransLink comes up with a cool app that we don't have to pay, development costs to do, I think we would join to do something like that.
Okay, so you've alluded earlier to the issues of funding, the big questions on funding, and that clearly, obviously, affects your perspective going forward. So you'd mentioned the reduction in, well, I guess the absence of fare box revenue for a while, and now it's coming back to some extent, maybe 50% of whatever you were getting before. Gas tax is somewhat recovering. I know in the US, for instance, the federal government has stepped in to kind of help agencies like the CTA in Chicago and others. Is there a similar program for you in Canada? Or is the province stepping in perhaps?
Nope. So we have no transit agents, with the exception of the province of Quebec. Okay. No transit agency has received any promise of financial relief. When the U.S. passed the CARES Act way back in April, and the $25 billion for transits, at least for emergency, we thought in Canada that that would suggest that the government of Canada eventually would do the same. And we've been working very hard with lots of people nationwide within the industry and at the provincial level to see to it that some kind of emergency relief for the transit sector would be forthcoming, but it has not happened. The government structure in Canada is different than in the United States. The federal government's a little bit weaker. The provinces are a little stronger, more powerful, and the federal government's attitude here at the moment remains that it's a provincial responsibility, which has some historical precedent. Now, that said, about a month ago, the Prime Minister announced $14.8 billion in direct aid to provinces, and transits would be one of the eligible sources. So we remain optimistic that at the end of the day, and we hope by the early fall, we will receive aid. We're working very closely with our province here in BC. They're very aligned with our interests. They do not want to see TransLink or BC Transit in the province having to cut way back on service. They believe, number one, that would be contrary to public health objectives, and number two, that would be contrary to economic recovery. So I'm kind of optimistic that in the end we'll get aid. We're still going to have deficits. In best case scenario, we're assuming by mid-year next year, this time next year, when we're assuming there'll be a vaccine, we're looking at anywhere from $500 million to $1 billion of deficit for TransLink. It's a lot of money.
So what's your strategy for dealing with that?
Well, first we have to see how much financial aid we will get. We're already spending down our reserves. TransLink was fortunate going into this. We had very, very strong balance sheet. So it's not called a rainy day fund, but in effect it became the rainy day fund. We are able to cushion some of the blow, but the extent to which we receive financial aid and the definition of that financial aid, whether it's operating or capital or both, will determine then how we deal with the situation. I think we hope we don't have to cut back on transit service. I'm sure we're going to have to do budget cuts. I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on our capital program and our major expansion programs. And I think down the road, I don't believe it's a 2020 conversation, but down the road, new funding tools. We're just going to have to think about and identify new funding tools, which unfortunately mean fees or taxes. But that's probably down the road as we start to better understand, probably by next year when we know better the arc of the whole COVID crisis, what structural damage has been done to our finances. And that's where new revenue sources probably needed to repair the structural damage. The immediate crisis management, we need financial aid to manage the crisis.
So looking strategically, the big topic of debate in transportation planning in general, but also for transit agencies, is that there's the fact that there's been so much teleworking, people are working from home and so on, is going to change demand, forever. History has shown that many such predictions have not come to pass, whether it's earthquakes, Olympic Games, and so on. There's always been sort of a return to, normal conditions. There's, some companies will shift, they will introduce possibly more flexibility and so on, but nothing that is as apocalyptic, I guess, as what we're hearing today. Do you foresee a similar return to typical work and travel behavior, or is this time really different?
Well, no one knows. So I'm going to give you my personal opinion, because we debate this all the time. I mean, we're even debating our own future of work for our employees. In the first week of March, everybody went to work, and we did not have a teleworking program at TransLink. And by the fourth week of March, everybody was working from home, and actually pretty successfully. So clearly, crisis is the mother of invention. I think that a lot of the predictions of permanent change in our society are maybe overblown in the moment. Where people will travel will never be the same.
Exactly.
How we interact, socially will never be the same. We'll never shake hands again, and people won't come back to work. Well, we surveyed our employees at TransLink a couple months ago, and what do you think about working from home? Oh, we love it. This is great. Like 90%, oh, it's great. Now the novelty's worn off a bit. Yeah. I do not like working from home, personally. I'm kind of tired of it. I want to be in the office. I want to be interacting with people. and I'm an empty nester. I don't have kids at home, nor do I have pets. Well, what if you have kids at home, or a dog that's always barking, or someone, it's just too busy. So now, more recently, the most recent survey, which is almost complete with our own employees, well, we'd like a hybrid environment, where we'd have the choice maybe to come to work some days and not come to work other days. Well, I think the novelty to a degree is going to wear off.
Exactly.
Do I think that this opens the door to probably more flexible work? Certainly in our environment at TransLink, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that it's going to be a permanent, profound change? I think human beings are social animals, honestly. And I think at the end of the day, to say that, you never have to come to work and you can interact with your workplace like you and I are interacting now on Zoom, I think that gets old. Exactly. And I think at the end of the day, human interaction stimulates creativity. Absolutely. And it just stimulates the mind and the spirit. Okay. So how permanent will the change be? I don't know. I think, though, people are going to want to come back to work eventually, and organizations are going to want them to come back to work. This kind of spike in creativity, in productivity. Why is that? Because I'm locked to my chair. That's right. From 7 o'clock until 5:30 or 6 every single day. And I'm getting sick of that. To be honest, my butt hurts. And I think over time, that's just not sustainable either. I think people need to go back to, that different sort of balance of how you.
Not to mention onboarding new employees and kind of, training new people, and then passing on the sort of the tools of the trade, etc. This is my last question. TransLink is a multimodal agency. Do you see an opportunity for enhanced cooperation with TNC providers, the Ubers and Lyfts of the world, or bike share services, to enable mobility for non-essential travel in the near term, and then potentially in the longer term?
For me here in Vancouver, that's an interesting question, because Vancouver was the last major urban area in all of North America to finally license TNCs at the end of last year. So Uber and Lyft and the others were just starting when COVID hit. So they've obviously been hit very badly. So it's still an incredibly immature, service in our region. But yes, we had already, prior to COVID, I didn't oppose TNCs. I think there's positives on mobility and there are negatives on traffic and congestion. So I think we had already planned to, and we will continue to look to partner with TNCs, with micro-mobility purveyors. Clearly, I think in urban areas, cycling probably, back to your question about whether teleworking, working from home takes, is even stronger. I think we're going to see more people biking to work, e-bikes, the huge demand increase in e-bikes. So I think similarly, we've got to be looking at micro-mobility, and whether that's different partnering with Uber and Lyft and others, or find micro-mobility solutions. However, they will not substitute for the benefits of high-capacity transit. You can't. You cannot replace the people-moving power of our SkyTrain and of our major bus routes. And at the end of the day, one of the strengths of the TransLink system that made for our extremely strong ridership growth over the last number of years is the integrated nature of our network. We feed a lot of our high-capacity system through feeder bus routes that are pretty well ubiquitous through so much of the more densely populated area of our region. So once we start getting back to a semblance of normalcy after there's a vaccine, I think most of those riders are really going to come back. And the extent to which they don't will probably be more affected by other factors like people working from home and other changes. So I actually still think, at least in our environment, the partnerships with TNCs and micromobility will still be a niche of our sector that we will continue to mine and figure out what's the right balance point. But the people in the region, I think, are still going to want, their local bus service, their local feeder bus service to get them to trunk routes and SkyTrain.
Excellent. Well, this has been very informative, Kevin. Thank you very much. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
No, when I was asked to do this interview, I jump at it. I think, as I said earlier, the sharing of information is vital. We benefited from so much from learning what was going on in Paris and London and Tokyo and Hong Kong and Chicago and New York City. And I think that that sharing has to happen. We are making this stuff as we go along. Mm-hmm. You know, we are improvising, we're innovating, we're being creative. And this intense sharing of best practices and new ideas elsewhere in the world, when I see a great new idea that we're not doing, I'm going to grab it and steal it.
Well, thank you very much, and I wish you all the best going forward.
Okay, thank you so much. Good luck with your project.
Thanks.
Of course.
Okay, so Julian, you're head of corporate finance at Transport for London. Since you joined in 2007, you've worked on some very impressive big projects like the Crossrail 1 project, £15 billion worth, seeing new funding stream through close to implementation. Also helped put together funding for the Northern Line to Battersea Power Station and the rail extension at Barking. So you have quite a bit of experience in, I guess, really deploying, I guess, public transport at a metropolitan level. So we're delighted to have you with us so you can share with us some of the experience that London for Transport has had through COVID-19, but particularly as we try to reopen our cities and our economies. And it's been, of course, over 3 months since the initial lockdown orders that were put in place in most cities around the world. With that, a lot of social economic activities ground to a halt. Ridership for public transport dropped considerably, again, across the board, not surprisingly. But cities are in different stages of kind of rebuilding, reopening, you know, carefully. So the main concern today is how do we reconcile some of these health-related concerns, fears as well, and the economic implications of that with the need for efficient mobility in our recovering cities, because mass transport obviously plays a key role and a vital role in moving essential workers and so on. So I'm going to ask you first a question about operational aspects, recognizing that may not be your primary area of operation. And during that sort of March to May period, what would you say were the most challenging operational aspects for Transport for London? Has it been the ability to maintain, say, cleaning, disinfection schedules? Has it been the health of workers? Has it been adjusting schedules to possibly address shifting ridership patterns or other considerations?
Well, I think my operational colleagues have done a great deal, and their focus has been to keep a service that is essential for London operating. In our discussions with both the Mayor of London, and we report to the Mayor of London, and also with the government, they've both been clear that they wanted TfL's tube and bus services to continue running, even while the advice to, as it were, the population was do not travel unless it's necessary. Now, the reason for that is that in a city like London, many essential workers do not live near their place of work. So you have to keep the transport system running to provide for, you know, those essential workers, even at the most difficult stages of lockdown.
Mm-hmm. So the Mayor of London's office is asking all Londoners to please continue to stay at home if you can and avoid using public transport unless it is essential. And I believe from Monday, June 15, the government made it mandatory for passengers to wear a face covering for the entirety of any journeys made using public transport.
Yes.
How is Transport for London informing riders of alternative mobility options and more generally communicating with its riders about these recommendations?
We're communicating in the way we normally do. We communicate, you know, through the internet and other media. We communicate, you know, on our stations, we use our staff to communicate with passengers. I think the core sort of aspect is that the guidance has been gradually changing in London, and obviously more people have been beginning to travel, because of that. But we are very concerned to be able to operate our services in a safe way with as much social distancing as is appropriate. And that includes the use of masks. And they are now, mandatory unless you have a reason not to wear a mask. They are mandatory on our services.
So going back to this notion of physically distanced transit ridership, which of course leaders in transit industry say is almost a contradictory notion to that of public transport and mass transport. Generally, are there physical restrictions, as in blocking off seats, for example, on buses or on trains, or is one relying on people to essentially self-enforce and comply with these aspects?
There are places in which we can use, physical methods. We can control some of the, the entry points onto the system. We can instruct bus drivers to only travel with a certain number. Clearly family groups are allowed to be together. Yeah, the issue is, how many groups of people can you fit, within the particular spaces.
How cooperative and compliant have riders been?
I think the traveling public, again, this is something my operational colleagues are closer to, has been highly compliant. And in some ways, the other issue for mass transit is how do we persuade people when it's appropriate to do so to come back and use mass transit?
Are you aware of any formal approaches that Transport for London is using to build back confidence among the traveling public?
Well, you're always in these situations trying to think a stage or so ahead. For the moment, our guidance remains that, you should not be using public transport unless it's necessary. We leave it up to people's own judgment as what necessary is. And we then start thinking, okay, what's the point at which we begin to change that message? As I said, it's not quite yet, but it may be fairly soon.
Okay, so looking ahead, in the medium term and then longer term, first, could you tell us about how Transport for London might be using data to monitor ongoing progress and developments? Because everybody tells us the situation is very dynamic, it's changing every day, we have to adapt and so on. What kind of data collection approaches?
The travel patterns every day.
Yes.
The Oyster system enables us to track particular users across the system, so we get quite good data on what journeys are being taken and the patterns of those journeys. And that gives us, an understanding of what is happening in the London economy as well.
So I've heard from one of our academic colleagues through one of the UITP committees mentioning recent research that they have been conducting for Transport for London about safety on buses and trains. Could you share with us perhaps what research Transport for London might be conducting relating to the pandemic? Is it limited to health, or are you considering planning and economic type aspects of the operation?
Well, we're doing a lot of, you might say, research or analysis into the financial and economic consequences, and that I am quite close to.
Yes.
I'm not as close to, the work that is going on in terms of safety, but safety is TfL's top priority. We will operate a safe system.
So I'm gonna ask you now the main question for you, which is the reduction in ridership has certainly impacted fare box revenue.
Yes.
How have government programs helped mitigate funding issues? And what is the outlook for continued support? In the US, for example, the CARES Act has provided significant stopgap subsidy for many of the larger transit properties. What is the approach in the UK to this?
So the approach for TfL is bespoke. We are the only sort of body of our scale in the UK. Clearly, there are other transport authorities. There are some other, light metro systems in other cities, but there is nothing to the scale of TfL.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
If you look around the world at authorities, and I chair the UITP Economics Committee, one of the things that we are most interested in is what is, what we call quite often the coverage ratio. What's the relationship between your fare income, possibly the extra income that you get from things like advertising and shops, etc. on top, and how does that compare to your cost base? Now, in general, having a relatively high coverage ratio is a good thing because it means you are less dependent on government. It means that you are more able to operate a business that has a sort of a commercial heart to it. However, in a situation where 90% of your fare revenue disappears in a couple of weeks, the coverage ratio becomes your enemy. And you will see that the authorities that have the highest coverage ratios have been most dramatically affected by this pandemic. And TfL and the London system is generally seen as having one of the highest coverage ratios, and therefore the scale of the losses that we have seen is significantly greater than in many other places.
What is that coverage ratio typically pre-COVID? Approximately
70%.
Okay, thank you.
There are accounting issues. It's a fact that my international committee has studied. It depends what you count in those two things, but in general, you'll be saying that TfL was around 70%. It's a slightly smaller number if you include all the investments as well, and that takes you down to a bit over 50% of the total cash flow through the organization.
Thank you. So how are you then dealing with the shortfall?
Well, as you can see, it was a very marked and very dramatic effect. And so we were in immediate discussions with the central government in the UK. It took a couple of months to come to an agreement. During those couple of months, about £1 billion sterling of cash disappeared from our organization. And the deal that was done allows for an injection of between 1.6 and 1.9 billion sterling during the half year between April and October. And the majority of that will be grant, but an element of that will be a loan from our central government. Now that protects our position. It protects us with a cash balance of a bit more than 1 month's spending. And we then will have further discussions with the government about what happens in the second half, remember, of the financial year. A British financial year is an April to March year. The government has announced that there will be a longer term review of TfL, of its efficiency and of its financial and funding structures. And I know that the Mayor of London will also want to look at what the options are for putting TfL on a sound long-term basis.
So other than the coverage ratio, what kind of metrics do you track regarding financial performance?
Well, we're interested. We track a measure that is an operating surplus. So that's quite close to the sort of a profitability for a business. We track our cash balances, obviously, because as became, very evident in March and April, actually having a few months of cash in the bank was really important. We track our own investment spend, and we track the levels of borrowing that we have done, and that's obviously important to both us and to the credit rating agencies. So we use a variety of metrics. We do tend to divide our business into a number of parts because they have very different financing and funding issues for the tube, which covers its costs but can't quite meet its investment costs, to buses where there's not much investment but there is a need for an operating subsidy, to roads where we're providing a lot of services on the highway network in London, for which we do not charge. And therefore we're operating something much more like a traditional public service where there is spending and not very much income. There is some income, obviously, from the congestion charge.
So obviously, trying to predict ridership in this environment is very tricky, very difficult, because nobody can really predict what the virus is going to do at this point. There's that whole health uncertainty that's going on. But one of the discussions that is actively going on among transport planners has to do with whether demand will bounce back and whether it will bounce back to what it was before COVID, mostly because, the logic goes that since so many people have been teleworking and, entities have continued to operate with teleworking, that perhaps that some of these adjustments may become more permanent. Yet history has shown that similar past predictions of widespread moves to telework because of various disruptive events, whether it's Olympic Games or earthquakes and so on, have not quite materialized. What is your view on this? Do you foresee a similar return to sort of more typical work and travel behavior, or is this time really different?
Well, I think you have a range of uncertainties that play out over the short to medium to long term. As you said, there is the uncertainty as to what the virus is going to do. There is also an uncertainty about what capacity of service that you can deliver whilst maintaining, appropriate social distancing and meeting government regulations. There is then a psychological factor that even if you're supplying the service, will people want to travel on it? And then, as you said, there are these social factors. Will people want to travel into city centres? London's a very agglomerated city with huge flows of traffic into the centre, and with the centre being the driving heart of its economy.
That's right.
So will we see social changes? Will people perhaps only travel in future 3 days a week if they have found that they can work effectively from home? Now, I don't know the answers to those questions, and I don't think as TfL we would say we know the answers. So we've been trying to construct in the short term funding packages with the government that will flex a bit. And the big area where they flex is this recovery of revenues from an extremely low base. And then we've been trying to do scenarios for London going forwards, which do include this sort of technological revolution, but also include a return to normal, and then a sort of a more sort of stagnant or economically depressed situation, because clearly there's not just these direct transport effects, but if the effect is to make certain cities, certain countries, economically depressed in the medium term, then that will clearly have a knock-on effect to mass transit revenues.
Of course.
Our government, our mayor, very much hope that those things will not happen.
Like that's most of the world, actually.
Yeah, but we don't know, do we?
Exactly. So are these challenges, I guess, creating an impetus perhaps for rethinking some of the business models, particularly looking at opportunities to partner with other providers such as transport network companies, ride-hailing, micromobility, bike share services, and so on, to kind of provide more mobility as a service concept?
We're keen on promoting cycling and walking. It's one of those things that I talked about where we provide, facilities, but don't actually, there's no charging mechanism. Yeah. We'll look at other ways of moving people, around London. We think that the answer is not in London a return to greater car use. We've reintroduced the congestion charge. The fundamental and first problem is that the costs of the existing public transport network are pretty fixed. The revenues have disappeared and are now coming back a bit. So you have a gap. So before you almost start saying, well, we'd like to spend money on this and this and this in addition, you have to think about, well, how can we cover that gap? And that's the stage that we're in at present.
No, I guess part of it might be, and I'm referring more to the US context, there are areas where mobility could be provided, possibly at lower cost by third-party providers, and some areas that may, where they may then provide feeder services to higher density lines.
If you're talking about, say the bus service or, things like that, we have talked, in these scenario terms that you could reconfigure over time. Our bus service is contracted out, so it's quite difficult to reconfigure it quickly. And offer different forms of bus service. Now, those are very tricky things to do. They need quite a lot of management. They can't necessarily be done quickly. But you cannot fundamentally reconfigure your metro or underground service. It is where it is. And its costs, to a certain extent, are what they are. And if you've decided that it is an essential service, and you now have a large funding gap, then closing that funding gap and working out who is going to pay for that system is your number one priority.
Absolutely. So, Julian, this has been very informative. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
Well, I hope your webinar is successful. I think there is a great deal for us to learn from the experience of other transport authorities. I think the shapes of recovery in different cities are extremely interesting. And, I remain an optimist for mass transit, for public transport going forwards. And I remain optimistic about the economic performance of cities. I think that we will probably see things go back to a pattern of growth relatively quickly. But we do have to try and adapt where we can to a changing world.
Well, thank you very much for your time today and for your valuable insight. I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Great. So, Jérôme, you're Senior Director for Global Growth at the International Association of Public Transport, UITP, Union Internationale des Transports Publics, coordinating its network of 15 regional offices worldwide. Previously, you led UITP's international advocacy activities, focusing notably on the economic case for public transport and the future role of public transport in cities. You've championed inclusion of mobility in the new urban agenda adopted at the Habitat 3 conference, and you've supervised UITP strategic projects and urban transport data collection activities. Before that, you've worked with the European Commission and the International City Network Polis. So you've had quite a bit of experience, I guess, and you have a really broad view of what is happening in public transport in our cities. So, of course, it's been several months since we've had these lockdown orders in most cities around the world at different times. And with that, social economic activities changed over that period. And I'm talking talking now sort of March to May, essentially. Transit ridership, not surprisingly, dropped considerably. And as as cities have started reopening cautiously, we've noticed that overall mobility has increased. If you track like cell phone data and so on, it's pretty much recovered. But when you look at public transport, there is still quite a bit of apprehension, I would say, toward transit use, understandably. But of course, we know that many essential workers can't get to work without transit, and many of our larger cities would choke without efficient public transportation. So our main theme today, and the theme that we've had with various transit system managers, has been reconciling health-related concerns on one hand, and then sort of the need for efficient mobility in our recovering cities. And of course, you have a global view of agencies across the world. And of course, when you talk to somebody in the transit industry, they tell you each agency, each city, its property is different and unique, but surely there are many commonalities as well. And so from your vantage point, what have been the most challenging operational issues faced by transit providers during this past period? Again, we're talking March to May, essentially. Has it been the ability to maintain cleaning schedules, or the health of workers, adjusting service schedules to address evolving ridership patterns, funding constraints, or other external events? What can you tell us?
I think that during the lockdown, the main priority for the transit providers was to ensure the health and the safety of the frontline staff and the passengers. And different schemes were put in place, and they are well known now. For instance, entering buses through the rear door, ensuring the physical protection of the staff and the drivers, no more handling of cash, and cleaning. I think that cleaning and disinfection was particularly challenging. The transit providers had to figure out which products to use to have an antiviral effect, which techniques were the most efficient to disinfect the vehicles, a number of them testing UV lights for this. The staff had to be trained, and new routines had to be put in place, for instance, to clean the vehicles more frequently while they were in operations. So I think that the key word is flexibility in the planning of the operations, and it was crucial to face absenteeism of staff, and also to redistribute the workforce that had to carry out extensive cleaning of the vehicles, for instance. And what I would add is that there is a lot to be learned from what was implemented a bit in emergency to improve service quality and also to improve resilience in the long term. And this is in terms of the management of the passengers, the management of the staff, and also the management of the assets.
So you think some of these practices will probably continue past the crisis?
I do, and I think that it is important to build that in the operations in the future to be more resilient and more efficient.
So let's go back to this notion of physically distanced transit, which some people consider to be a contradiction of terms, okay? And so how does this notion of physically distanced transit ridership differ around the world? And also, I know in some places, for example, there have been hard restrictions where some seats are physically blocked or where there are barriers, but others have mentioned it as desirable targets when possible. And how cooperative have riders been from city to city in your experience? Are there any cities that stand out in terms of cooperation and compliance versus others where riders are notoriously ignoring all instructions?
So this is not an easy question. As you said, physical distancing is one area where you have very different standards and very different levels of enforcement in different countries around the world. So the rules for physical distancing, they are expressed in different ways. For instance, in terms of the maximum capacity of the vehicle, for instance, 50% of the normal capacity, or it is expressed in terms of the minimum distance between passengers, and this is changing 1 meter, 1.5 meters, 2 meters. So there is no universal rule. And even in one city, the rules tend to evolve over time. So I think that it is commonly accepted that in Asia, in Tokyo or in Hong Kong, for instance, that there is less focus on physical distancing than in Europe. And in Asia, the use of the mask is more pervasive. So the operators, the transit operators, are supposed to enforce the rules. And they've used different technologies to manage the capacities and the flows. I can give you some examples.
Yes, please.
Milan, for instance, is using CCTV to monitor the safe distancing and also to monitor the occupancy of the vehicles. In Paris and Berlin, the operators are using also CCTV to monitor the use of the masks. And
is this on buses only, or buses and trains, or trains only?
Yeah, it's on buses and trains and metros. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
You see that in TransLink in London or in Sydney for the trains, they are using real-time information based on the sensors on the doors. In Denmark for the Danish railways, or in Taipei, so you see different cities, they are using real-time information based on the weight sensors they have on the vehicles. Mm-hmm. In Auckland, in New Zealand, they are using real-time information based on the live data they have for the transport cards. And so, Transdev, which is an international operator, is monitoring the capacity of their buses using crowd sources data. So you see there are very different measures. Mm-hmm. And when the operators, when they monitor the demand very closely, they are able to adapt the offer, but with higher numbers of passengers coming back, it's also difficult to strictly enforce physical distancing.
Exactly. So they're monitoring primarily to adjust the supply rather than to do enforcement, because that is indeed a challenging question there. So
yeah, okay. And so this is a question. Not only of behavior but also of density of demand in the different networks.
Are you seeing this evolve currently in various cities, again, as this reopening is starting? For example, last week we talked to the president of the Chicago Transit Authority, and they're trying to maintain, I believe, 15 persons per bus as a target, but they're already finding that on many of their routes, they are exceeding these numbers. So they're putting more buses, allocating more vehicles to increase the frequency so that they can maintain that. Are you seeing that in other agencies as well, like where there is more of an adjustment based on what they're sensing?
Yeah, definitely. In many cities, they are using the information they are collecting, and often in real time, in order to be able to adjust the supply. So in some cases, you cannot adjust in real time.
Yes.
And in other cases, for instance, when you have automated operations with automated trains, it's slightly easier to adjust the supply in real time.
Okay. So, of course, with the reduction in ridership, that has certainly impacted fare box revenue for most transit agencies. How substantial is this revenue shortfall and the resulting gap in funding? Of course, different agencies have different business models. Some rely heavily on subsidies, others rely much more on the fare box. In the same roundtable with you, in fact, we have Julian Ware from Transport for London, where they essentially rely fairly heavily on the fare box, but then they had not been collecting because of free boarding. And so how substantial is this issue? And is it an existential threat for some agencies from, again, based on your perspective and your view? And how have government programs helped mitigate some of these funding issues? And what may be the outlook for continued support?
So starting first with the evolution of demand. So indeed, as you mentioned, most networks, they've experienced significant decrease of the demand during the lockdown, by between 70 to 90%. And the decrease in passenger revenue was in line with that. Now, with the lockdown ending in many cities, we see that the passenger numbers are increasing again, but they remain much lower than before the lockdown. I think we 30–40% lower. So what we see is a revenue crisis for public transport. And the main effect is on passenger revenue, so indeed the ticket sales, but also on other revenues, such as advertisements and revenues from congestion charging and other revenues that are earmarked for public transport. And as you mentioned before, the impact is felt more strongly, obviously, when the reliance on passenger revenue is higher. So when the coverage rate is higher. But what we can see if we compare cities, we see that we have very different variations across cities. You mentioned London. There are other cities that are less relying on the fares. And so whether the shortfall in revenue affects more the provider or the authority, the regulator, depends a little bit on the share of risks between them and the contractual arrangements. So in many cities in Europe, and I guess also in North America, the revenue risk is not borne by the transit provider, but is borne by the authority. So the provider is less affected. But of course, when the risk of the revenue is with the provider, the effect is much stronger. And so I mentioned this is a revenue crisis for public transport, but it is also a cost crisis. We have mentioned a lot of extra activities for cleaning that had to be put in place. And so we have a majority of our members have reported an increase in their expenses for 2020, alongside a strong decrease in the revenues. And to give you just one example, the costs of cleaning and disinfection in Paris has increased tenfold in 2020 if we compare to the previous year, 2019. So you also asked me about the mechanism that are put in place to support the sector.
Yes, so exactly. Continuation of public support obviously requires making the case all over again to the general public and to decision makers for why transit is vital to urban mobility and to the economy of cities. How is UITP helping agencies around the world in that regard? And I've seen some of the flyers and brochures that you have put together, and I've been very impressed actually with several of these.
So I guess you mentioned the campaign we have launched a few days ago that we call Back to Better Mobility.
Yes.
So, and this is a campaign that focuses on three areas: breathe better, move better, and work better. And I think that we all enjoyed much better air quality and also less congestion during the lockdown. And the campaign that we are launching aims to show that transit is the way to reconcile cleaner air, reduce congestion, but also convenient access to all the activities and all the opportunities that are offered by the city, including work, education, leisure, and so on. So and this is the aim of this campaign. And in general, at UITP, we provide ammunitions in the forms of facts and figures to transit providers. And we also engage directly with the decision makers to highlight the key role played by public transport, and not only in terms of supporting the economy, but also in terms of improving quality of life, and also fight the other crisis that we had at the door, the climate change.
So some have argued that through this experience that, sort of the dense urban patterns that we're used to are probably going to change and that there are forces pushing towards more re-suburbanization, if you wish. And partly, part of the argument is that with so many people teleworking, that we will have much more of that, and that many companies will continue doing this. Of course, the other side is that history has shown that past predictions of such widespread moves to teleworking, when there have been major disruptions like earthquakes or Olympic Games or hurricanes or whatever, have generally not materialized because, of course, there is clearly importance of physical presence, interaction for innovation, and so on. So do you see a sort of a similar return to typical work and travel behavior, or is this time really different? Because some will argue, well, this time is really different. And what is your view? And I realize this may be more your personal view than, say, your UITP's view. Do you think this will differ by regions around the world?
Yeah, first, I think it is too early to be definitive about this. But at the same time, it seems that the duration of the lockdown and also the greater availability of digital technologies and the greater use of digital technologies could lead to an increased use of teleworking and also home deliveries after the COVID crisis. Mm-hmm. And definitely this will have an impact on mobility, not only on the number of trips, but also on the length and the duration and the origin and destination of the trips. So if you go to work once a week, the distance between where you live and where you work may become less of an issue. Mm-hmm. But what I also think is that this impact, especially the impact in terms of the length of the trip and the origin and the destination of the trip, maybe not so significant in the short term, but might become more important in the long term. And simply because the decisions about where we live and where the offices are located take time to be made, and they take time to have effects. So on this very topic, long before COVID, we saw a number of cities had plans to become more multipolar, to have less trips from the periphery to the center and more local trips in sub-centers, like in Singapore, for instance. And it might be that COVID will somehow support the achievement of these policies faster than we thought.
So the pandemic has helped generate conversations around rethinking transit, not to mention rethinking cities. And you alluded to that, obviously, about rethinking mobility, cleaner air, et cetera, particularly, again, with an eye towards more environmentally sustainable objectives. And one of the elements or opportunities pertains to the role that transport network companies, ride-hailing, ride-sharing, and micromobility might play in the urban fabric, and the extent of competition versus complementarity with conventional transit. I mean, that conversation had been ongoing before COVID. Has the pandemic accelerated, perhaps, any developments related to a more harmonious or integrated view of mobility as a service and the role of conventional transit in that context? And what innovative thinking perhaps has surfaced around the world on this topic?
Well, first, I think that there are things that we knew before the COVID crisis. For instance, the fact that walking, cycling, micromobility were important, and that they were complementary to mass transit is something that we knew already. I think what we have learned from the crisis is that if we want people to practice walking, to practice cycling and use micromobility, we do need to provide adequate infrastructure for these modes. And we've seen many cities in Europe, but also I think also around the world, creating in few days pop-up lanes for cycles, parking space for micromobility. In Europe, we have many examples like in Paris or Milan or Brussels. I think what is crucial here is that if these developments are to stay in the long term, they need to be integrated with mass transit in order to optimize the complementarity. And I think that something else that we have learned from the crisis is that the business models, or the current business models for micromobility and the new mobility services, they are quite fragile. And we have seen a number of those operators going out of business during the crisis. So if we want them to play a role in the cities alongside public transport in the long term, I think that the framing and the procurement of these services has to be reviewed to ensure the resilience.
That's a very good point. Very good point. So, Jérôme, this has been, again, a very informative exchange. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
Yeah, there is one sentence that I like is necessity is the mother of invention. And I think we have seen in this crisis that many public transport, many transit organizations, they have adapted to the crisis. They've shown flexibility and they've shown capacity of innovation. And I think that now the challenge or the step that is ahead of us is to transform this into new practices that will stay in the long term and that will make the operations more efficient and also more resilient.
Okay. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you.
With pleasure.
This is the part where we go live, and I'm pleased that we have, I believe, most of our panelists with us today live. I know we have Julian, we have Jérôme, and Brad, Kevin with us today as well.
Yep, I am looking for everyone to onboard them here.
So I'd like to introduce our Senior Associate Director of the Transportation Center at Northwestern, Brett Johnson. He has been moderating the Q&A line, and I know we have received some very good questions for our panelists today. And so without further ado, I see that we have Kevin Desmond with us. Great, welcome. Special thanks to, first of all, to Jérôme for staying up this late in Brussels, and to Julian, again, staying up this late in London. Kevin, you're on the West Coast, so it's a little easier for you. So I'm, again, delighted that you could join us. Brett, you want to start with the first question?
Yes, thank you, Hani. And thanks to the speakers for being with us here today and tonight. This first question is from Andrew Bada, and it's really directed towards London and Vancouver. And his question is, are there any discussions with city businesses to stagger working hours to spread out the loading on trains and buses? Perhaps we could start with Kevin.
Sure. Actually, I'm meeting tomorrow with the heads of our British Columbia Chamber of Commerce, entity called the Business Council of BC, and the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. They are the three leading business associations in our region to talk about how we can best manage this recovery phase with COVID, how we can both keep our environment safe and welcome our customers back. And also to learn a bit about what they are hearing from the business community, their members. They just published this morning, as a matter of fact, I think their third, what they call their pulse check. And it's clear a lot of employers are not going to be bringing their employees back anytime soon. So, you know, there are issues like, say, staggered work hours, but there's also the reality of probably continued depressed demand just because people aren't going to be commuting as much, certainly not office workers. So I think our objective is safety of the general community, what works best for businesses so that they can recover and we can see an economic recovery, and how can we manage to accommodate riders in our transit system when we have, as all three of us have talked about, this different dimension and understanding of transit capacity, you know, prior to COVID. So Alternative work schedules, absolutely, they're in existence today, and they're going to be very much part of the reality. I think I mentioned in my pre-recorded remarks, we're actually seeing a greater increase in our ridership in the off-peak period than in the peak period. So I think people are, in effect, selecting that off-peak period as a matter of fact. And if that's to a degree because their employers are allowing more flexibility, then that's a good thing.
Julian, you want to give us your view?
Well, I don't have very much to add to what Kevin has said. We're just seeing, you'll have seen from my earlier remarks, the UK government beginning to say it may change its position. What I am hearing is that people may not return to offices for a standard office day. So it's not so much a staggered start as a kind of partial return to office working, which might be a few hours in the middle of the day. It might be meeting people in city centre cafes. There are a range of possibilities. Hopefully, they will match with the safe capacity of the transport system.
Jerome, any other views from your network about this issue?
Yes, it's interesting because staggering working hours is not a new idea. It's in fact a very old idea that so far has had very few applications. But we have seen within UITP a renewed interest in this to the extent that we have even created within UITP a working group with a number of our members looking at how to work with this with different partners in the city, with businesses, with schools and universities, and of course with the business community. So there is really renewed interest in this topic, and it might be that we see more applications that we had in the past.
Thank you. Brett, what's your next question?
I wanted to ask another question from Andrew, and his question is, and I think everyone can address this, do you see any permanent design changes for public transport, such as different seating designs in trains and buses? And how about the design of stations, entrances, other aspects of the system?
Same order. Kevin, you want to take that one?
Well, Andy, you're just pushing us, aren't you? Andy and I go way back. Yeah, I think I personally believe it's too soon to say. We're still in the throes of the COVID crisis. And even as we're innovating and sort of just improvising on how the flow works in our station areas today, how the flow might work on the buses, on the trains, to anticipate what the more permanent changes might be, I personally believe are a little bit premature. I mean, to be able to understand how society a year from now, 18 months from now, thinks about social distancing, thinks about wearing masks for that matter, which was very common in Asia, not common in the least bit in North America. North Americans are, many of them, pushing back against masks. So I think it's a little early to say and to predict what those future permanent type changes are going to be, other than clearly from a design standpoint and an operating standpoint, public health is certainly going to, I think, be elevated in our thinking. You know, safety first. We all, as transit operators, safety is the most important thing that we do each and every day. Maybe public health was not as important in that safety component. I think safety, the public health will probably be elevated now in future design decisions in terms of spatial characteristics, loading guidelines on the system. Loading guidelines and spatial characteristics all equal money, because if it needs more space, that costs more money. And for your physical design, if you have to reduce your loading capacities, that might mean you'd actually need more vehicles and more service to carry the same number of people. Lots of implications. It's not exactly clear in my mind as yet how those implications will really play out a year or 2 years from now. But we're all thinking about that in this industry.
Good point. Julian?
I think the point I would make is just think of the typical life of these assets. So a London bus operator, we don't own the buses, might expect to operate a bus in London for 14 years. That's 2 contract lengths. A tube train has a life of, say, 30, possibly longer in years. And we're still using some underground infrastructure that is 150 years old. So changing things is really expensive. And it's not just what happens in the vehicle. You've also got narrow entry passages and stations and other issues that you'd have to deal with.
Excellent. Jerome, anything you can add to that?
Yes, I mean, like Kevin, I can't really think in terms of long-term design changes, but I think that there are clearly changes in practices that we see. First, the enhanced cleaning of the vehicles is something that will stay in the long term, that's for sure. And I think operators have understood and that this is an important element in recreating trust and making public transport more attractive. I think that also we have seen an adaptation of supply to demand that has been done more in real time. And I think this is something that is also going to stay in the long term, as well as the increased flexibility in the organization of the work that was necessary during the crisis. I think this is something that will probably also stay in the long term. So more changes in terms of practices, in terms of planning and operations than design per se.
Thank you. Well, let me take this opportunity actually to thank Andrew Bata, FUITP, who represents UITP on our center's Business Advisory Council. Andrew has been instrumental in putting, in fact, this session together. In addition, of course, to having Jérôme from UITP, I should mention that Julian chairs the Economics Committee of UITP. And of course, we've heard of Kevin's connection as well to Andy. So thank you, Andy, for helping us put this together today. Brett, next question.
All right, I'm going to combine two questions from Tony Mattingly related to ridership. First question is, are you anticipating that a significant share of riders will use your system differently in the long run post-pandemic? And kind of associated with that, is your agency contemplating changes to its fare structures in post-COVID as well?
Well, I guess I'll start again. Right now, we're at about 40% of pre-COVID ridership. So it's been increasing. It's been increasing more or less what our planners predicted. British Columbia is in our third phase of the reopening. So right now, we're, knock on wood, we're doing fairly well. Our planners, however, are at best predicting about 70% of pre-COVID ridership by early next year. And that's based on a lot of very complicated scenario planning, and there's a lot of guesswork, particularly in terms of whether there's a second wave, repeated waves, and what happens associated with each one of those waves. We do not think that ridership will return to pre-COVID levels for quite some time, although I will say, at least in the Vancouver region, here in British Columbia, we have a really robust transit culture, transit environment, and our land uses very much support transit, and our highway network does not support more driving and more cars. I think that, to me, the biggest question is twofold. One is that public trust and confidence in once again taking transit in large numbers and being willing to be on a crowded bus or train. And number two is the extent to which teleworking becomes very permanent in a very large way, or if that itself is somewhat temporary. So, we just don't know. We're all in the same position throughout the world. Fare structure is a really interesting issue. It's going to be a complicated issue. We're supposed to do a fare increase of 25 cents on July 1st, and we postponed that. And I know other transit agencies that were planning fare increases roughly in this time have similarly had to postpone it. Bad time to raise a fare, obviously, during the pandemic. So we're already hurting because of lost ridership, and now in fact, deferring a fare increase. So we have to be very careful in how we manage our fare system. So I think the question that we've been asking ourselves goes back to the first question that Mr. Bata asked is, do we do other things to further try to encourage people to take service off-peak, which is always a good thing because it's less crowded, and the more we can make our off-peak services effective, that's really good for the cost effectiveness of the system. So the other thing that's come up is rewards programs, more as a temporary measure to try to incent riders to come back.
Thank you. Julian?
Well, I said quite a lot in my sort of piece, which we saw earlier, about the sort of uncertainty and the different levels of uncertainty. I think that, you know, Kevin's sort of projections are about in the middle of the range, and ours are about the same. Now, if I move on to fares, we've had 4 years of a fare freeze. That was a political policy of the current mayor. He has agreed with the government that the fares will rise in January by inflation plus 1%. So we will go back to a model of annual increases in fares. It's not going to raise a lot of revenue, and it's not really a solution to the financial problems.
Thank you. Jérôme?
Yes, so we have gathered data from quite a large number of networks around the world, and in general, we see that nowadays the traffic, the demand is between 30 and 50% of what it was before the crisis. And then I have in front of me the results of a number of surveys done in different countries around the world about the intention of people in terms of the mobility habits in the next 6 months, in the short-term future. And if I consider this different study, you see that we can expect a decrease of the demand for public transport that is between 20 and 40% compared to pre-COVID levels.
Thank you.
I should also ask, so another part of that question was, are you launching any new fare products in response to the pandemic, perhaps touchless payment systems or things of that nature?
Well, in London, obviously, we already have an essentially touchless payment system in the Oyster card. We, I think, have been asked to review by the government the concessions that we currently use, you know, the groups that can travel at reduced or nil cost. I think it's going to be more difficult to actually make changes in those.
Yeah, we're the same. We already have a contactless smart card system that we call Compass. So much of our systems are already contactless. The portion of cash on the system, which is really only on the buses, is comparatively small. Maybe this will accelerate the move to cashless. Our friends at Transport for London, Julian, they've been leaders in that topic for many years. So I think there may be other innovations that might come from not having to necessarily touch the touch screens on the vending machines, for example. That's the one point that people who are still buying single payment tickets or reloading their smart card, they still have to touch. And that might be something that innovators can bring to the fore. I should say we launched an open innovation call about 3 weeks ago, and the focus is on these types of public safety COVID-related ideas. And one of those ideas are accelerating touchless elements of a system. So we're looking for innovators and entrepreneurs to give us ideas that might be actionable in the near term.
We've heard a lot about these issues. I think, Jérôme, is there anything you want to add to this, or should we move on?
Very quickly, I mean, we have seen a clear acceleration in terms of digitalization of ticketing and payments using different technologies. You have the use of QR codes, Bluetooth, facial recognition, and we have some instances also of compulsory pre-booking of the tickets before the trip.
Is anybody doing facial recognition in transit?
I think there are some experiments that are being made, and at a very experimental stage at the moment. But I think this is something that is considered now as something for the future. Yes.
Well,
you can use both facial recognition. You can also, in a sense, track people through things like mobile phones. You know, there are data issues with this, and you know, some people will might find it personally intrusive, and those things will need to be balanced by operators and authorities.
Exactly. I mean, you do some, you know, you have facial recognition for someone, then they have a mask, and then you don't recognize them anymore. And how do you do that?
Yeah, but it may be that their mobile phone gives you a better indication.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Brett, next, what do you have?
I have a question from Raymond Hall, who asks, he wants to know if you've encountered any significant business operational savings while your staff has worked from home, and when do you expect staff to remain at the levels they are now, and when do you expect them to head back to the office?
Julian, you want to take the, oh, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, we just talked at length about that, our executive team this morning. In a certain sense, it's the opposite. I mean, on the one hand, we're not going to bring our employees back, our administrative employees back to the office place for months, except on a as needed basis. And pretty much everyone's reporting that their productivity's been maintained, if not actually improved to a degree. But on the other hand, we're going to be facing higher costs. So if it becomes more of a long-term, which it's looking likely, reality of people working from home, there are likely going to be requirements, demands from our employees to provide them with certain tools, ergonomic tools, chairs, desks, which the types of tools that we'd give people in the office environment, computer, and other IT features. And similarly, if we bring them back in the office, we're going to have to do infrastructure changes at some expense to reconfigure our office space. So unfortunately, one way or the other, while our productivity may be holding okay, we're probably going to have to spend some money, almost certainly, to accommodate people in large numbers working from home. And when they come back to work, to manage the social distancing and the health impacts is going to cost money to reconfigure our office space.
Julian?
I really can only agree with that answer. Very, very similar for us. People who can work from home, I think, will be encouraged to do so. It will be months before things get back to any sort of previous situation. Obviously, you know, that's what happens with one set of staff. Most transport operators have large numbers of operational staff who are out on the system as they always are, working extremely hard.
That's right. Any further views, Jérôme, from your experience?
No, I don't have much to add, except to say that, and I think I've mentioned that before, that we see in some networks some attempts to organize the work in more flexible ways, and that could lead to some savings. But I think that, as we all know, there are things that are not very easy to implement.
Thank you. Brett, I believe you had a question for Julian on TNCs.
I kind of wanted to combine that with another, if you don't mind, Hani, related from Moyne.
No, I think they're different actually. Go ahead with the London one first, and then maybe backwards. Yeah.
All right. Zaina Nazir has a question for you, Julian. Let me get to it here. The question really has to do with TfL partnering with other transit providers and wanting to know whether or not you may consider banning Uber again because there are concerns about congestion in the London, in the London metropolitan area that we're all aware of. I think that's the great question: is what are what are TfL's thoughts about partnering with micromobility, and how does that relate to your congestion issues?
Well, I got asked that on my, pitch earlier, and I gave an answer. Now, TfL's unusual in that it's also the regulator, yeah? So we're not only providing public transport, but we were regulating taxis and minicabs. I think my position is as I gave it, which is we provide a fairly, thorough service. We're always interested in ways that we can look at that. We've got a substantial funding gap for that service. Clearly, as a regulator, we operate in a sort of quasi-judicial or whatever way and need to be fair and play by the rules.
So no further plans to ban Uber?
I'm not saying.
Well, let me move on to a related question about partnerships from Wayne Hosseini, who is a PhD student in our program. He said last week, our seminar speakers provided examples of partnerships between agencies and other organizations that were especially useful or have continued to be useful during the pandemic. And he wants to know, could you provide any specific examples of partnerships involving your agencies that were formed during the pandemic or were formed prior to the pandemic and became especially useful during the pandemic? So
Give this one to Kevin first.
related question.
Yeah.
I'll have a short answer is basically no. The extent to which we did have a variety of partnerships, they've not been any further catalyzed by the crisis. As I said a few minutes ago, I think our third open call for innovation is our way to try to find partnerships with entrepreneurs and academia for smart new ideas that can become actionable. So at least in our environment, we were kind of on our own to other than listening to all of our transit partners. UITP, by the way, Jerome, has been outstanding, and Andy on the call in circulating information. So I suppose if we had partners we were tapping into, it's the transit community worldwide through UITP, APTA in the United States, CUDA here in Canada, and we've all benefited from that sharing of information. And this particular event is a great sharing of information. I think the interesting question is new partnerships going forward as we see, and I think Hani, you've mentioned that. I think you asked everybody that in the pre-recorded session, where and how new innovative partnerships can help in the post-COVID world to maybe reimagine elements of our business.
So last week, for example, Nat Ford of Jacksonville mentioned a partnership where they were relying on an autonomous microbus or autonomous vehicle, essentially to transport COVID samples in a medical type campus. And we, I thought that was an interesting opportunity essentially for autonomous vehicles, because they were kind of leveraging that, that capability in that limited environment. So that was, I think, the example that stood out from our conversation last time. Jerome, any examples that you can think of to address this question?
Yeah, I mean, precisely what you mentioned, we have seen in different cities, not especially in terms of automated transport, but we have seen in a number of cities partnership with hospitals and medical centers where dedicated lines or at least adapted schedule were put in place to transport people who had to go for tests or to transport medical staff. So we have seen that in a number of cities indeed.
Julian, any further examples on your end?
Well, I think you've taken, a lot of them. I've seen quite a lot of cooperation, obviously, with the UITP. I think, again, colleagues of mine would talk about the cooperation between the different public services in London, the police, the municipalities and so on. We've seen a lot of that coming through in terms of changes to road space recently. And I have been, with my colleagues, using every name in my telephone book to try and work with the British central government to help us deal with our financial issues.
Exactly. Thank you.
If I could jump in, you mentioned, and that was, Julian made an interesting point, because we're just ourselves starting this, but I know I've seen this certainly in the North American environment, is trying to take advantage of the current situation and working with municipalities on bus priority treatments. On the one hand, municipalities, here in Vancouver, for example, they've worked very, very quickly to allow restaurants to open up patios on sidewalks that otherwise would never have been permitted before. They've closed, I think, 20 kilometers of streets in Vancouver to do some traffic calming, open up active transportation. And similarly, we want to work with municipalities to see if we can accelerate some of the bus priority treatments that otherwise maybe might have moved a little bit more slowly as we think about the current and post COVID. So that certainly is an example of pending partnerships, at least from our perspective, but partnerships that I've seen in other cities, and I'm sure UITP's got lots of examples of that on a worldwide basis as well.
Thank you. Brett, do you have any more good questions?
We always qualify them, but I'm going to ask these. Sarah LaBelle has read that Tokyo is running with packed trains, and they've not seen a resurgence in COVID illnesses. She wants to know if any of you are aware of that high ridership in Tokyo, and if so, is this any reason to persuade people that it's safe to ride transit, and that transit is not really the cause of the spread of the disease?
Maybe we'll start with Jerome this time.
Officials, though.
Yeah, I think we've all seen these pictures already a few weeks ago of packed trains in Tokyo. And indeed, I can confirm that there was no report that there was any increase in the infections related to that. And so it's interesting because you see that indeed in Asia, and you mentioned Tokyo, but you can see a similar situation in Hong Kong, for instance, and in other cities in Seoul, that there is less issues with physical distancing, and there is a natural use of the mask, even if they were not compulsory in Tokyo until recently. And so it's true that you see less of issues of physical distancing, or less concern with that, I would say, in Asian cities. And so it's probably a good lesson also we can learn in other cities around the world.
Kevin, do you think your riders will buy that?
That is, you know, we've seen that, you know, and we circulated that around. I think, you know, following on that, there's also been, you know, a number of articles written pointing out that there, to my knowledge and anything I've read, there is not a single shred of evidence of community transmission on public transportation. And I think that Tokyo illustration, you know, it makes an interesting point that you can accommodate this pandemic world without necessarily endangering the public. Now, you always have to be careful and cautious. I've on the one hand, part of me wants to get my communications people to push that out, but you just have to be very cautious, because as soon as there is one example of community transmission vectored on transit, then that creates a problem. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I think, you know, in Asian communities, there is a cultural acceptance of wearing masks. So I think also everyone on those Tokyo trains are wearing masks. Even as we launched a campaign a few weeks ago, we call Wearing is Caring, to try to encourage our riders to wear masks. It's not mandated in Vancouver. Only about a third of our customers are probably wearing masks at this point. So we have a ways to go to, I think, convince our customers what they have to do to keep themselves and their fellow customers safe. So I think it's a bit of a fine line. I'm encouraged that there is no evidence of community transmission, but I think here in the North American environment, we still have a lot of public education to do for how to safely use public transportation and to otherwise be out and about in public.
Julian, is the Tokyo example convincing to Londoners?
Well, what I've seen and heard from UITP, you know, contacts is that we see these really very interesting cultural differences, a very different approach in, you know, the East, as it were, than in the Americas, different again in South America and Africa than from Europe. And I suspect people will be studying that for years. One thing that a colleague from actually China said to me a week or so ago was, you won't see the real picture until you're out of lockdown. If you're still in a lockdown or a semi-lockdown, then you think that that is going to continue forever. And it's not until the measures really will start to ease that we'll see how quickly things will get back to normal or not.
Exactly. Thank you. Well, this is, we're approaching the time where we need to be winding down. I'm grateful again to all of you for being here with us. I kind of wanted to go through once and kind of give everyone an opportunity, maybe for a few final words, you know, given the discussion that we've had here. So Kevin, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, first, I just want to applaud Northwestern for holding this event. And I don't know who all is listening in, but it sounds like some of your students. So it's great that you're exposing your student body to kind of this worldwide discussion about public transit. Public transit needs to recover. Our cities, our metropolitan regions, our sustainable growth, our climate really requires public transit to recover. It's complicated. There are many industries that are being hurt, and some hurt even worse than transit, like the airline and travel industry. But at least from where I stand in our part of the world, it's vital, and it's got to recover, and it's going to require a lot of partnerships, a lot of cooperation and patience. But recover we will, and I'm convinced of that. And the more that we are widely sharing best practices, new ideas, new innovations, we just all have to keep our minds open to try to implement many of those ideas and innovations, so we do come back even stronger.
Thank you. Jérôme, you want to go next?
Thank you. Yeah, we speak about the new normal a lot, and I think that we tend to overestimate what will change in the short term. Maybe we underestimate what will change in the long term. And a lot of things are happening now for which we will see impacts, I think, in the long term, because they are underpinned by decisions that take time to be made and that take time to have effects. But I think that there will be, in the long term, probably quite significant changes. And so I wanted to thank you for organizing this. And we organize at UITP and took part in a lot of webinars, and we always learn things by talking with others and answering to questions. So I would like to really thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. And Julian, would love to get the final words.
Again, thank you for running this session, which has been fascinating. I think my final comment would be, never let a crisis go to waste. From TfL's financial position, we'd known for some years that we had medium to long-term issues. We had growing debt levels. The funds coming in were not enough for the sorts of projects that we were being expected to do. A crisis has shown that up dramatically, and there's quite a lot of commitment to building TfL back up on a financially sustainable basis. And if we can achieve that, then something out of this terrible set of tragedies, something good could emerge.
Thank you very much. Well, to all of you, again, thank you for your time. To Jérôme and Julian, we say good night. Thank you for staying up with us this evening. To our audience, thank you for staying with us. This was the second of our asynchronous virtual roundtable in the Reopening Cities series. Next week, same time, we will be featuring e-delivery challenges in reopening our cities. So again, thank you very much all. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.